The G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting is scheduled for Tuesday in Italy. The meeting is one of several precursors to the G20 Leaders Summit, due to be hosted by Rome in October. Chinese Foreign Minister State Councilor Wang Yi and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, among other ministers, attend the meeting. The G20 this year focuses on building long-term global economic, environmental, and health recovery from the pandemic. But with the issues coming out of this month's G7 summit, will the positive function of G20 be upset by the U.S. division of small circles? What's high on the agenda? To discuss more, let's loop in our panelists. For more on the G20, we are joined in Chapel Hill by Klaus Laris, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. In Tokyo, YOSHIKAZU KATO, Adjunct Associate Professor from the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. Last but not least, in Washington, D.C., Peter KUZNICK, Professor of History from American University. And in Shanghai, Professor SHEN DINGLI from the Institute of International Studies with Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. I noticed that from the panel, 3 of you are from the G7 countries. Only Mr. Shen is from the G20 countries. So it's very interesting, our panel today. I hope you will be having more fair comments about the G20. First of all, Professor Shen, go to you. Do you see there's likely to be huge division among the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting this time as a result of China-U.S. relations?
The positioning of the G20 is to gather global momentum for global governance. At this time, global governance should aim at beating COVID and restoring the world economy, and also to improve a fair and more balanced global economic and investment regime. So this should be on the agenda of the G20 Foreign Minister, Financial Ministers Meeting, preparing for the October G20 Summit. So I do not expect that the G20 Foreign Minister Meeting would create a big outcome of anything. The meeting of the foreign minister is to prepare for the meeting of the summit. But foreign minister would address many critical issues. For instance, how to create a better system to promote the global coordination for defeating the COVID.
Yeah.
And possibly they would discuss how to create a future regime to prevent the recurrence of a similar global pandemic, and how to promote COVAX, and possibly to discuss whether the global corporate tax should be on the agenda for the global leaders, not the minister, but presidents and prime ministers.
Right.
All such global cooperation definitely would help improve bilateral, small multilateral relationship.
Now, we see right now the devastating situation of the pandemic once again is bringing us a new round of challenge with Delta variant spreading around the world. And we see among the G20 countries themselves, emerging countries, developing countries, as well as developed economies. Some of them are hard hit. Meanwhile, we also know that Japan is to host the very important Summer Olympics. And yet at this time, Delta variant become one of the biggest threats for the security of that specific Olympic Games. So how do you see that, in fact, the priorities needs to be set clear by the foreign ministers and eventually the leaders about what the G20 really needs to handle, the G7 really needs to handle right now? That is the pandemic, it seems. Mr. Kato.
Sure, you're right. Now for Tokyo, hosting Olympics successfully and safely, this is the most priority. But as you know, Japan hosted G20 meetings in person 2 years ago, and I remember we focused on digitalization. But at this moment, we have to talk more about how to tackle the pandemic. And now I do not think Japan could resolve the pandemic independently, bilaterally. So we need to rely on these multilateral platform. In this sense, I think G20 continues to be a very important platform for Japan's diplomacy. Of course, as Professor Shen DINGLI said, compared to G20 summit, foreign minister could talk critical issues more straightforwardly and frankly. So maybe we need to set some agenda to tackle the pandemic and how to restore the economy, and maybe some geopolitical economic issues might be agenda. But at the moment, for Japan, how to tackle the pandemic at the same time restore the world economy in this platform and consolidate the outcome of G7 with collaboration among G20 members. So this may be a very interesting issue. How to understand the co-relationship between G7 and G20, because this time Italy is hosting the G20 meetings, right? And Italy obviously is a member of G7, and Japan is as well. So it's an interesting time to take advantage of these multilateral platforms, I would say.
The thing is whether the priorities will really be the priorities and not be blurred by geopolitics. Professor KUZNICK, that is many's biggest concern leading up to the G20 Leaders Summit. But now, during Foreign Ministers Meeting, one could already smell probably the taste of the future summit.
Well, even when we get to this basic question about the pandemic, even this has been clouded by national rivalries, and it shouldn't be. There's no room here for this kind of competition. So if we need to be getting together on that issue, we need to be getting together on climate change, issues of resolving some of the hotspots around the world.
Right.
We've got things that are very much in our common interest that don't have to be matters of global contention into some kind of new Cold War framework. And hopefully that's the way the leaders are going to approach this in this foreign ministers meeting and in the upcoming summit in Rome.
But given the fact that it has never been far away from geopolitics, therefore, Professor Laris, how optimistic can we be? Not even optimistic, but how pragmatic do you see that the future G20 Leaders Summit could be? And also, since we talk about the G7, the earlier G7 meeting is not necessarily rallying the crowd, shall we say, because there is quite a strong geopolitical tone in it. So will the G7's meeting result be relevant to the G20, which is really a link between the developed economies and the developing and emerging economies, such as China, such as Brazil, such as South Africa, and many others? Professor.
Yeah, personally, I don't foresee a slanging match at the G20. We had the slanging match at that early meeting in Anchorage between the American and Chinese foreign ministers. And I think ever since they have given off steam and they have returned to more pragmatic policy making. And I cannot see, there may be differences and there may be conflicts, but I cannot see that we will have a slanging match at the forthcoming G20 meeting. The meeting is above all about the humanitarian crisis in Syria, about how to contain ISIS, perhaps also about the post-withdrawal situation in Afghanistan, which also opens the door for increased terrorist activities in this very important part of the world, which is also highly crucial to China. So I think China and the United States would have an interest in cooperating on anti-terrorist activities in that part of the world, but in other areas like in Syria as well. And COVID-19 and the pandemic will certainly be talked about, and other important issues like climate change as well. But as we saw from the G7 meeting and then Biden's meeting with Putin, this was a conflictual meeting, but it wasn't a shouting match. Biden and Putin got on relatively well. Of course, they disagreed on many issues, but they did not shout at each other. It wasn't a slanging match. And therefore, I believe also in the G20, there will be serious conflicts among the leading nations of the world, but we will not see shouting matches. I think both sides have an interest in approaching the issues which divide them in a pragmatic way and try to get to results as much as possible.
Professor Shen, now, there are so many issues that have already been politicized or geopoliticized. For example, about the origin of the virus, about the vaccinations, about the pace of vaccinations, about vaccines, who to give it to and not to give it to, use whose and not to use whose, and the list goes on. There are still many countries in the world that do not even have a single dose of the vaccines, any vaccines. There are also sanctions against countries who have any access to vaccines. So when we talk about a general theme of let's work on the pandemic, all these details need to be worked on. Otherwise, there's no way that we can work on this big issue. So a lot of nuance that is there. Professor Shen.
I do believe there are lots of areas where big power can work in a cooperative way. In principle, President Xi Jinping made it clear there is 1,000 reasons to improve China-US relations, and there is no single reason to damage the relationship. And also, fortunately, President Biden has made it clear the US would cooperate with China wherever it is possible. But the US is not scared to compete with China when it is necessary. So President Biden defined China as a major challenger, as a competitor. And he did not say, even though he could believe in his heart that China is a threat, but he said China is a challenger. Good. He is politically sensible. He wants to turn a potential threat to a possible collaborator. That is his political correctness. And in fact, I think China is not a threat to the US. China competes with US on many issues. For instance, to what I have read, China has exported 1 billion doses of Chinese-made vaccine. That pressed the US. So US is going to catch up, but the US has committed probably 50% of what China has already given. And US will spend about $2 trillion to build up Americans' infrastructure, including Americans' cyber infrastructure. Great. China has spent more over the last 20, 30 years. So such a China's internal improvement has actually pressurized the US. I think this is a nice pressure. So let's cooperate on COVAX. The US could say, I want to inspect you. China say, you can ask, but you cannot demand. It's up to WHO. And China can say, we also want to inspect the US base, whether you have created, had done some secretive research of this program. And you say, you are welcome, but you cannot demand. It's up to WHO. So let's have such a kind of competition. But possibly it's not vicious. It is a kind of a normal, if not healthy, at least a normal competition.
Is that wishful thinking, Professor KUZNICK?
It's wishful thinking, but I think it's the kind of wishful thinking that all four of us share.
Yes.
Because I mean,
and many of our audience around the world share as well.
It's rational thinking, but we have to put it in the context of what's actually going on right now. And that much of the world, we even saw it at the G7 meeting, Biden and the US were able to mobilize the G7 against China. They were able to get NATO now NATO's 2030 strategy, their new doctrine, the 2030 doctrine, is again focused against China in large part. The shifting the Asia pivot from the Middle East to Pacific is a way to contain China. NATO is changing its doctrine in order to address China as the main security threat. The United States says that the main threat to U.S. national security is China, even more than Russia. Part of the reason why Biden had a somewhat friendly summit with Putin is because at some place in his mind, he would like to separate Russia from China, the G7. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we're in a situation where the main dynamic, as I see it, is not toward the kind of cooperation that Professor SHEN so wisely is hoping for, but it's a different kind of dynamic that's pulling us apart and making us more adversaries than collaborators. That's not what the world needs right now, but both sides are doing things that are exacerbating those tensions right now. Does Biden have another side to him that he's capable of reaching out positively? Yes, and he's shown that often over the years. But he also is trying to differentiate himself from Donald Trump. And he's under political pressure in the United States from the Democrats and the Republicans. The one thing they agree on, the only thing that they have bipartisan agreement on, is opposition to China right now. Mm. So we're in a precarious situation. This is a sensitive time, and hopefully there'll be statesmen who share our vision and will move us in that direction.
Mm. Mr. Yoshikazu.
A lot of countries, including Japan, we are upset in front of the U.S.-China strategic rivalry. You know, this is somehow troublesome for, international collaboration. This is a reality. But now I think we shouldn't ignore the importance of multilateralism. I'm recalling back to history when Japan-China relations get worsened. Japan and China's leaders seeked to resolve their tensions through attending some multilateral, conference, including some APEC meeting, and just, for example, just meeting or chatting or just saying hello, and then, move on to, discuss some bilateral issues. So I think now, even if we are facing some bilateral tensions or, strategic rivalries, particularly between U.S. and China, but now it deserves embracing the importance of multilateralism, such as G20. Mm-hmm. Of course, this time Foreign Minister Wang Yi is attending from Beijing via Zoom. So, Secretary of State Blinken and Wang Yi are not going to meet in person. But I think, something would be happened, if they are getting together and, talk and meet in some ways. And I think this is quite relevant for, resolving or improving some, complicated bilateral relationships. So I think it is a good time to understand how to take advantage of these multilateral diplomacy to resolve bilateral tensions or geopolitical tensions even as well.
Professor Laris, you are originally coming from Germany, and I understand there is a very strong U.S. impact on the policies that European countries are making. In the European countries themselves, there are also complicated politics. For example, in Germany, change of chancellor in the future. How do you see that Germany, for example, other countries like France and the EU as a whole, likely to adjust their positions swiftly so that, or flexibly, so that they will be a go-betweener, to say the most, not a divider, and therefore leaving space for all sides, including themselves.
Yeah, first of all the Europeans, including Germany, are very relieved that Joe Biden is in the White House and not Donald Trump. They know that Joe Biden is a much more constructive politician who, of course, sees China as a challenger, maybe even as a threat, but he's much more constructive, much more pragmatic, and much more ready to deal with China in a constructive way than Donald Trump was and would be if he were still in the White House. Secondly, they are very close to the United States. They are happy about the revival of the transatlantic relationship. Only yesterday we had the Italian foreign minister saying quite clearly that he felt he was much closer to the EU, to NATO, and to the United States than Italy was close to China. And I think that applies to Germany and all other European countries as well. Thirdly, however, having said that, no one wants to be at loggerheads with China. No one wants to be enemies with China. Of course, China is a challenger and a competitor, but that is fairly normal. But they want to continue engaging with China, having very good economic relations with China, and they don't want to be, in the middle between a conflict between the United States and China. Whether the Europeans, including Germany, have the potential, the power, and the will to be a mediator between the United States and China, this must be questioned. I also wonder whether the Europeans are actually strong and influential enough to do that. Perhaps behind closed doors, when they are in 4-hour conversations with both their American and their Chinese counterparts, then they may try to, mend things and try to perhaps bring things together a bit better. But I don't think they want to be seen as officially a mediator between the United States and China. But they certainly also don't want to fall out with China. So they're in a very precarious situation. They, have to play a balancing act, if you like, but they are still closer to the United States for all sorts of reasons, be it values, be it interest, be it history, be it language, culture, all that kind of thing, of course, keeps them closer to the United States.
What about Germany, which you are coming originally from, not necessarily Italy, but rather Germany, with your upcoming political changes, particularly with the counselor in the hands of a different person, now still do not know what's going to happen. How is Germany's domestic politics likely to play out or design, in a way, its foreign policy agenda? And what would that mean for Germany's position and status within the EU vis-à-vis France regarding the issue of China, for example?
Well, with any change of chancellor in a country, and a chancellor who has been very influential, who has been in power and in office for 16 years, and of course created a lot of influence and impact during these 16 years, any change is a dramatic turnaround. A new person, whoever
Chancellor Merkel was regarded as a balancing person between the United States and China.
Merkel has been very much a balancing person between the United States and China, and she always was a voice of caution who didn't want to let things get out of hand. She has had very good both political and economic relations with China, and actually she has been the only Western politician, I would say, who also had a human rights influence on Chinese leaders, particularly behind closed doors. She could achieve things in human rights as well, and that was really quite unique among Western leaders. So her absence and her departure will be felt in German politics. The new person, whoever it may be, and it probably will again be the party leader of Merkel's party, of the Christian Democrats, he will have to find his way. He will have to rebuild relations with China and, of course, the United States. And that will take at least 6 months, I would say. So Germany will be less influential in the next 6 months after the election than it is right now.
Having said that, though, let's be also professional, not only to talk about the pandemic issue, but also to talk about the carbon issue, as well as the corporate tax. That's what we have been discussing over the last few months. How do you see, gentlemen, briefly, how those topics are likely to be raised and also discussed among players of various interests? Mr. Kato.
Yes, obviously, compared to G7, G20 would focus more on the comprehensive issues and more global issues. So I think in Japan we are discussing, the G20 foreign ministers are talking about, the reform of the World Trade Organization, climate change, and COVID-19, and corporate tax as well. So these are on agenda. So, but this would take time. until the G20 summit would be held. So, this is just going step by step. But we need to very critically raise up these critical questions on the table and talk very frankly and straightforwardly. And this is the most important mission for foreign leaders in G20.
Professor KUZNICK.
Well, I agree with that. Much in the same way that the pandemic taught us that we live in one interconnected world, the climate crisis is happening right before our eyes also. In the United States right now, we're going through a heat wave and a drought that is really unprecedented. In the Pacific Northwest, every day they're breaking new heat records. We got places like Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, where they're having 112, 114 degree temperatures. We've never seen anything like that. And so this is very real. We're seeing it around the world. We're seeing countries disappear because the sea levels are rising.
Right.
We're going to see mass famines. We're going to see migrations on a scale that's unprecedented. I mean, and the leaders around the world are moving much, much too slowly to deal with a crisis that's at our doorstep.
Right.
So hopefully at this G20 meeting, this is going to be something that's taken very, very seriously, and concrete steps are taken to expedite that timetable.
All right.
We can't wait for 2035, 2040, 2050, because the world is facing a global crisis right now and a potentially existential threat. So on top of the nuclear threat, on top of all these other issues that we're dealing with, the pandemic, we face a lot of serious problems, which is why we need real global leadership.
Okay. Professor Laris.
I agree with that fully. Climate change is a totally terrible looming threat, and that needs to be addressed as a matter of absolutely high urgency. And hopefully it is being done in the G20 and eventually also at that to be expected Biden-Xi summit, perhaps in October in Rome. The two leaders should really talk about how to speed up what we can do against Biden climate change. If Biden and Xi can't talk about it, if they can't make progress, who can? So we really need to depend on the leaders of this world to get their act together regarding climate change. Regarding tax on multinational companies, I believe the G20 is moving forward with that. They are supporting that. China itself hasn't yet taken a position on that, but I don't think that China is opposed to it. So whether it is in favor, because it's not really all that much affected by it, that remains to be seen. But on the whole, I would assume that progress regarding that international minimum tax on international corporations will be agreed, or at least progress will be made. So there is, again, there's hope for cooperation around the corner.
Professor SHEN.
For carbon, I think China has proposed that by 2030 we would reach a carbon peak. But the US and the G7 may be curious how high the peak will be. So this is depends upon China's increase of ability to cut carbon in a viable way. But the US can help China to lower the peak. Therefore, ministers need to talk how to collaborate rather than not to talk. And the minister talk, that would pave the way for the president's talk. So they should talk, but the US expect to get some return. But the Chinese view is that without talk, there is no outcome. So both sides need to fine-tune their attitude. China may tell we would make a best effort to lower the peak. US may have the view, whatever your peak is, I will be ready to talk.
Right.
And for tax, China's official tax is already more than 20%,
yes,
closing
indeed.
to 30%. Some say the real tax may be 44%. That's much heavier than the 15% the global tax reform may propose. So what the US has proposed does not challenge China at all. But U.S. Is curious. When China attracts foreign investment, China may have very low tax for the first 3 years. How to deal with this? To have the fine-tune, China US need to talk. But over time, China more depends its internal technology innovation in order to generate a job, rather than to attract the foreigner to invest in China to tap China's low labor cost in order to export again. So the two countries need to change their mentality. U.S. should understand China no longer depends export for the major portion of its economic development. China should also say, I may refine my way to attract a foreign investment for the first few years, how to accommodate the global reform.
Fascinating topics, always, and things are changing very fast. Thank you so much for always updating us about the latest from your own perspective, and looking forward to the result of the Foreign Ministers Meeting and certainly leading up to the Leaders Summit. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. Klaus Laris, YOSHIKAZU KATO, Peter KUZNICK, SHEN DINGLI. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight. Coming up in the program, we continue our series, China's News Stories, our conversations with young Chinese Communist Party members. Today, a young man who rides the waves of China's re-engagement with all things creative. Coming up. Welcome back. This is World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Now let's turn to our special series, China's News Stories. In our second episode, we continue telling the stories of young Chinese Communist Party members. As the Communist Party of China celebrates its 100th anniversary, how is the younger generation making the most of their own lives? Now let's meet Li Shuai, who's heading the art design department in one of China's most well-known pop music companies. Born in the 1980s, unlike earlier generations who put their lives on hold to work for their ideal world, Li Shuai directed his life to where he is today. His name is Ku Li. Well, that's a literal translation of his Chinese name Li Shuai into English. He does live up to his name though, with what the in-crowd would eye as a pretty cool job, running an art design department in one of China's most well-known pop music companies. Born in the 1980s, his life started from the days after China decided to pursue reform and opening up following the Cultural Revolution. Ku Li, just like his peers, had it better, at least material-wise, than his parents' generation, a well-heeled life throughout the decades. He's also a Communist Party of China member. But unlike those earlier generations who put their lives on hold, buckling down to work on an ideal world, Ku Li has set his direction in life to become what he is today.
I have gradually understood through some real experiences or even some setbacks in my life that not everything I want can be given to me. For example, if my wishes cannot be fulfilled or are not valued, that will also be a setback, which can be easily brought by our parents. Our parents always have their own difficulties and challenges, and some of which will be passed to their children. Once my wish could not be realized, and this wish was a wish I attach great importance to.
What was your biggest wish at the time?
When I was little, my dad brought me a Persian cat. She was white and a little chubby, very lovely. She clung to me, so we were pretty close. But my mother was a doctor. She might be less inclined to keep a cat, especially those furry pet animals. So she gave her away to their friends after 2 weeks. It was a huge blow to me. It felt like you couldn't tell if she was just a friend or just a pet.
Have you seen her afterwards?
I went to see her once. She seemed fine, and also she grew up, but not as carefully as I took care of her. She purred whenever she saw me. The life is equal. The seed may be laid at the bottom of my heart at the time.
So the cat stayed in your house for 2 weeks. Did you guys have fun?
I played with her a lot. The cat looked for me as soon as I got home, and then I cuddled her. At first I raised fish, and later I fished out all the fish for the cat to eat. The setbacks or experiences we've encountered when we were growing up will inform us that getting everything we want may not always be a good thing. If this person hadn't encountered any obstacles in the previous decades, perhaps he wouldn't develop thinking capacity and stress tolerance.
A blessing in disguise, as they say. Just like his peers, he has also been pondering about some profound existential questions, such as wealth, dreams, freedom, and even the significance of life. So Li Shuai, from the artist to the business person.
I used to think of art as a kind of persistence. I had inexplicable standards and bottom lines for myself, which I used as a rationale to reject all kinds of things that I didn't want to accept. For example, I felt I might end my artistic pursuits when I was working in the IT industry. The only thing I got was high pay. Then I started my own company. There was a vague goal, that I would pursue art after making money. I wanted to be an artist at the time. Actually, it is a kind of freedom.
What was on your mind then?
I wanted to be an artist at the time, and it is a yearning for freedom.
It felt like you're quoting lyrics from songs all the time.
The yearning for freedom? I think I can fly. After that stage, I found that I tore the pit of my heart. It turned out that I couldn't let go of my artistic pursuits. Money and art, I think, they must complement each other. Now I feel they should be integrated. And fine art is a successful business. Especially after experiencing the epidemic last year, we found that we were very lucky in a way. Such big loss set us thinking. You are soon likely to become enlightened. When we look at the world from a negative perspective, the whole world is sad and gray. But if we see the world from a positive perspective, it is easier to digest and appreciate the negativity. The world is getting better when we take positive energy. I won't be like an art critic, describing my works as assets to store capital and moved by collectors. But I think some emotions are for the masses, just like sometimes when we watch a movie or listen to a piece of music, we will be moved to tears. So what touches us? I feel that there is always something sincere that impresses people.
The company Ku Li works in has been a trendsetter in China's urban music scene. He told me he enjoyed people watching more these days, standing in the quiet corners watching the young celebrating their life. It's such a sweet and satisfying moment.
我最近其实在5月中旬的时候，在广州的那个 MDSK 音乐节。
I was actually at the music festival in Guangzhou in mid-May. At the time, the temperature in Guangzhou seemed to be 37 to 39 degrees Celsius. Then, I saw many young people running. The majority of them were little girls. Their faces are red and purple after being sunburned. But they were all smiling, and they are all genuinely happy. They didn't care about being sunburnt at that moment. They were just enjoying themselves. When I felt their energy, I saw myself many years ago. At that moment, I felt like it gave me more meaning to my job.